Hi, everyone. Welcome to Transitioning to College for Students with Paralysis. The Reed Foundation is pleased to announce a new partnership with Accessible College. Accessible College provides college preparation and transition support for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. The Reed Foundation is sponsoring a limited number of free consultations with Accessible College so that there is no charge to the student or their family for the service. Today's webinar will be hosted by Annie Tolkien, the founder and director of Accessible College. Now I'm going to turn it over to Annie. Hi, Annie.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be here on this webinar with everybody today. So once again, welcome to our webinar on transitioning to college for students with paralysis. I'm Annie Tolkien. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College, and I'm super excited to share information with you all today on this partnership that Accessible College has with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. We hope that this will help increase access to college for students with paralysis and provide students with the necessary tools and support to be successful in college. A few technical points as we get started here today. So just so everyone knows, your videos are off and you are muted. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the coming days on the Reeve Foundation website. We will take your questions at the end, but if you have a question during the presentation, you can go ahead and put that down in the Q&A box or in the chat box. So we'll monitor the chat throughout this webinar. So put a question there. And if you want closed captioning during this presentation, we have captioners, and you should be able to hit the closed captioning button down at the bottom of your screen. If you're having trouble finding that, you can chat and one of the moderators will get back to you on how to find that. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, I'm Annie Tolkien. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College. And the mission of Accessible College is to provide students with physical disabilities and health conditions and their families with supports to ensure a successful transition to higher education. So at Accessible College, we work with students with a variety of health conditions, including POTS, lupus, cancer, chronic fatigue, Crohn's, and mental health conditions, as well as students with physical disabilities, such as students who are paralyzed, use wheelchairs, have other mobility impairments, visual impairments, and hearing impairments. And the reason we do that is because we know that colleges and universities provide varying levels of support for students with disabilities and health conditions. And the services that Accessible College provides helps to bridge the gaps and empower students and families to effectively work together to create positive educational experiences for students. So a little bit about me. I have over 10 years of experience in the disability field. Nearly 6 of those were spent as the Associate Director of the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University, which is Georgetown's Disability Support Office. My experience spans nationally and internationally. My background is in education with a degree in secondary education from DePaul University in Chicago and a master's in education from the special education from the University of Wisconsin. I also have a certificate in health coaching from Georgetown University as well. I was a Peace Corps volunteer too in Mongolia, and later on I was a Fulbright Fellow in Mongolia, where I studied Mongolian teachers' perceptions of disability in the classroom. But the real catalyst for me to launch Accessible College is the time I spent at Georgetown University as the Associate Director of the Academic Resource Center. So there I worked with undergraduate, graduate, and medical school students with physical disabilities and health conditions who were seeking accommodations. So I was the person engaging students in that interactive process. I was reviewing their documentation and determining reasonable accommodations. And the accommodations that students received ranged from academic and testing accommodations, so things like flexibility in attendance or extra time, preferential seating, note takers, to housing accommodations. So some examples of those would be a private room, an ADA accessible room, access to a kitchen, things like that. I also oversaw all of the academic support services for the entire student body at Georgetown University, providing workshops and one-on-one meetings with students on topics like time management, organization, and study skills. Many of the students that I worked with when I was at Georgetown had not been made aware that they would now be responsible for following the university's process to request accommodations. Additionally, no one had really guided them in thinking through the process of determining how their disability might impact their daily life on campus or support them in making plans for how they would continue their care once they were living on campus. So these students were really left unprepared. And that's when I knew that there was a need for support and guidance with transition before students were reaching college. And that's where accessible college can be really effective. So we start working with students in the ninth grade through graduate school to ensure that they have the necessary self-advocacy skills and supports to provide for that smooth transition to college. And over the years, I've worked with students with paralysis and students who are wheelchair users and mobility device users, and I've learned a lot. And I use that experience as a former university administrator to now inform my process when I'm working with students who are then in turn better informed and better positioned to advocate for their needs. So let's talk about this great project. Through this partnership, Accessible College will provide one-on-one consultation to students with paralysis through the Reeve Foundation. You can think of these consultations as sessions, so I kind of use those words interchangeably. There are a limited number of consultations available overall, and the number of sessions with each client will be limited as well. We'll talk in detail about what to expect during and from these sessions in the coming slides. But briefly, these are 1 hour, one-on-one sessions. And through the project, we are able to provide up to 3 sessions for each student free of charge. And again, that means no charge to the student or the family for the service, so it's free. And they would just need to call the Reeve information specialist to get started. And the number is on this slide, and that's 1-800-539-7309. And I'll post it again at the end as well, so you don't need to feverishly write it down now. I also wanted to let you all know that I created a transition planning booklet through the Reeve Foundation, which is focused on students with paralysis transitioning to college. And the booklet has tons of information, and I'm really excited to get it into everybody's hands. And it should be released in the coming months too, so you should be on the lookout for that as well. So let's contextualize this conversation about college transition for students with paralysis. And I think it's important to really ground ourselves in data and look at some of the data. So we have federal data that indicates that approximately 19% of undergraduate students report having a disability. And that includes learning disabilities, ADD, mobility impairments, psychiatric disabilities, and health conditions. It's important to note again that this is self-reported data. So these are the students who have gone into the disability support office, provided documentation, and have been approved for accommodations in the college setting. So it's highly likely that the number of students with disabilities on college campuses is actually much higher than, than we have here. So we need to also remember that that makes students with disabilities one of the largest minority groups on a college campus, which mirrors what we see in the country as well, where people with disabilities are the largest minority group. So we also have some data here from a 2011 study, which indicates that about 7% of college students who report having a disability indicate that they have a physical disability or a mobility impairment. So this data confirms that students with physical disabilities are in college, and we know that as students who were educated in inclusive and accessible classroom settings in K through 12, as they move forward, we will continue to see more students with all types of disabilities in the college setting. And we want to make sure that we can assist them in preparing for that transition so they can be successful all the way through college. So now that we know the data, we should look at the laws. First, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which is the law that governs special education services for students with disabilities and provides for free and appropriate public education and services in the K through 12 setting. So if your student has an IEP, an individualized education program, it's because of this law. However, if your student is in a private school, those schools are not bound by IDEA. But that leads us to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, 1973, which is a law, or excuse me, an act that protects against discrimination on the basis of a disability. So your student might have a 504 plan, which outlines their accommodations, and private and public schools have to adhere to Section 504. It applies to both K through 12 and to the college setting. When your student graduates high school and moves on to college, the accommodations process is governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Just this past July was the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And a big difference from high school is that once the student's in college, the student has to be engaged in the interactive process. They have to be able to request their own accommodations. So in high school, the parents are typically involved and engaged in connecting with teachers and administrators, advocating on behalf of the student. But once the student gets to college, if they're seeking accommodations, they'll need to be able to do that by themselves. So this type of preparation requires time, and it requires a very intentional approach to make sure that your student has those skills to be able to effectively communicate what their needs are. Finally, we have FERPA, the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And this is the law that typically surprises parents the most. Once your student matriculates to college, once they've signed that dotted line and you've signed that dotted line, FERPA prevents the college from sharing information such as grades or class schedules or disciplinary action. So students and families might choose to sign a FERPA waiver, which would allow the parents to have access to that information. And this is typically done through the registrar's office of the college, and it requires an agreement between the student and the parents. So that was our brief legal overview. And I wanted to give you a sense of kind of where the rubber meets the road, the differences between the accommodations practice in high school versus college, because I found that a lot of students and families are really unaware of how the laws change and what that actually means in practice. So in high school, students with disabilities are identified by the school, and the teachers and administrator typically know about the accommodations because they're written out and defined in that IEP or in the academic plan. But in college, it's the student's responsibility to disclose a disability to the disability support office and provide documentation. So the student needs to be the one who's leading the charge, and the student has to be comfortable talking about their disability, and they have to know what their needs are. In high school, the school usually takes the lead in arranging for accommodations. So if your student gets extra time on tests, for example, the school knows that information and they make those arrangements for your student. Once the student's in college, the student has to engage in that interactive process and arrange their accommodations. So they have to meet with the counselor in the disability support office, provide that documentation, get approved for the accommodation, and then building off that example for extra time. At the college level, most schools have a process to request to take a test or an exam in a testing center, which typically involves making a request at least 7 days prior to the exam so that they can make sure to reserve a space for you. So that requires really, really important planning and organizational skills on the part of the student. The student has to know how to request to take an exam with accommodations through the disability support office, and they have to do that on a specific timeline, which is really different from what might happen in your high school setting. And finally, the other example I have here is that in high school, the teachers typically identify when the student needs support. So they can connect with parents and they can share information. But in college, the student has to be proactive in seeking out support. So they have to go to the professor's office hours. Maybe they're hiring tutors or taking advantage of any services, support services that the school offers. It's a big shift because students have to be able to identify when something isn't working for them, when they need support. And this is where a lot of students experience challenges. This is why it's so important to start working with students on these skills early so that they can develop these essential self-advocacy skills to ensure college success. And we also know that transition services can really vary from high school to high school. So if your student has an IEP, Transition is usually a part of that conversation. There's a box on most IEPs about transition and how your student's transitioning. But if your student has a 504 plan, they don't receive any transition support services. And we know that for students with physical disabilities and health conditions that fall outside the typical scope of what a college counselor or a learning specialist at a school maybe has managed before, these students need a more specialized approach in order to be prepared. And that's the kind of specialized approach that we offer at Accessible College. So we talked a little bit about the process of requesting accommodations in the college setting, which requires the student to connect with the Disability Support Office and to disclose their disability. And then the student has to provide that documentation. And in most cases, for a student with paralysis, that would be a letter from their healthcare provider that outlines their functional limitations, so the challenges that they have in the academic setting, and also recommends accommodations as well. And I actually work a lot with families and with healthcare providers on documentation because college is really different from the high school setting, especially if you're living on campus. And it's also very different from the workplace setting, which some doctors may be familiar with writing accommodations for the workplace setting. But there are kind of little nuances that are different between the college setting and the workplace setting. And so I work with families and with healthcare providers to make sure that they have appropriate documentation for the college setting. Um, it's important for families to know too that students can also submit their 504 plan or their IEP to the Disability Support Office, but these are not typically accepted as primary documentation. They are, however, really good for showing a history of accommodations and helping the people in the Disability Support Office understand the types of accommodations that a student may have received previously. So here on this slide, I've outlined some examples of accommodations that students with paralysis might request in the college setting. It's not an exhaustive list. It's just some examples. And so in the academic setting, and I think the thing to note here is I've outlined different settings on campus where a student might need to request accommodations or might want to request accommodations. So it's not just academics. But in the academic setting, they might want to request things like extra time or priority registration, which would allow them to choose classes that work with their schedule. So if your student needs more time in the morning or has a personal care attendant who's going to be assisting them in getting dressed or getting ready for classes, they might need more time in the morning and not to have 8 a.m. classes. Um, so priority registration can help with that. It can also allow them to make sure that they have enough time between classes if they're going to be traveling from building to building. A laptop in class, and that could be for notes or for recording a lecture. Classroom relocation is another example of an accommodation so that the students' classes can be closer together, sometimes even in the same building or even in the same classroom, or to make sure that the classroom locations are accessible for the student. Flexible attendance. So in case your student is unable to get to class or they have to miss class for a medical reason, most of these academic accommodations are typically somewhat transferable or similar to what a student may have had in the high school setting. One thing to note is that colleges do not offer one-on-one aides to assist students. So if your student needs more assistance, like with getting to and from classes or getting out their books from their bag or getting prepared for their classes, they would probably have to hire a personal care attendant. And we'll talk a little bit about that too as we move along because it comes up in a couple other places as well. So in terms of residential accommodations, a student might request an ADA accessible room. They might also request to have a personal care attendant, which could be a live-in person or an hourly person, depending on the student's needs. Typically, personal care attendants help with things like toileting, daily living type activities that the student might need support with. And as I said a moment ago, the college does not provide or pay for the PCA, but the student would need an accommodation to allow the PCA to live in the residence hall with them or to access the dorm. So they would have their own, the PCA would have their own card to be able to enter in and enter into the dorm. And universities have their own processes for how they how they allow students with personal care attendants to live on campus, and what process they need to go through to allow that person to be living in the dorm. So each individual institution is going to be different. So every college is going to have a different policy on that. So the other things to be thinking about in terms of the residential setting is the accessibility of the space for the student. We all know that what is ADA compliant might not be actually user-friendly to that specific student. So some of the things that I help students think through are their specific space needs, and also the logistics of living in a college residence hall. So most residence halls have a swipe card where students have to swipe to get in. So sometimes we have to think through, well, can you actually use a swipe card? Is that going to work for you, or do we need to ask for an accommodation related to that? Most residence hall rooms have keys, thinking through, can your student use a key? Do we need to ask for a different type of lock for their room? So there's a lot of little intricacies and things that most people don't think about, but I often think about because I support students in thinking through that process prior to them actually being on campus. So the next piece here is recreation. This is another area where students typically don't realize that they can request accommodations. So that might be things like adaptive fitness equipment, or a chairlift for the pool, or accessible student center facilities. So now most colleges and universities have big student centers, which are gathering places for students, although during COVID, that's not really happening, but in normal times, students are assembling in these student center facilities, and they might have gaming and other types of activities there. So if students want to be able to work out, or they want to have access to something that their peers have access to on campus, there are ways to request those types of accommodations. So I help students kind of think through that as they're navigating their college search process, or as they're transitioning to college. Dining accommodations, this is another area that a lot of people don't think about. So it might be, allergy-free dining, gluten-free, or supporting the student in the dining hall. Maybe student needs special meals, or they need help or assistance with their food selection. Most schools these days have a dining hall where there's kind of individual kiosks, and the student goes up and they can have things made for them, or they can choose their own food. For students with paralysis, they might need help, with the food selection, or with putting things on a tray, or even with cutting up individual things for them to eat. So there are a number of accommodations that students can request based on their needs, but each college is going to have a different approach as to how they navigate these issues with the students. So it's really crucial that we're thinking about these things prior to the student enrolling in that university, so that we can have a better sense of what it's actually going to look like for them when they're there, living there during their time in college. And then finally, programmatic accommodations. So things like accessible seating and accessible transportation. This comes up a lot with students, with colleges that have sports teams and are bringing big speakers onto campus. So if your student wants to attend those types of events, different universities have different policies on accessibility. There might be an accessibility statement on the university's events. Like if there's a flyer up and it says, you can contact this person if you need an accommodation. That's one of the things I actually tell students to look for when they're touring a campus, to see if there are accessibility statements on the events that the college has. Because if there aren't, that typically means that you're going to have to jump through a few more hoops to be able to get that accessible seating or to get that accessible transportation. The university has to provide them, but it's not always clear who you have to contact and how you would get that accommodation in place. And so that might be something that you want to look for. It could be really important for you to inquire about those things prior to going to that school. And just a quick story that I wanted to share. When I was working at Georgetown University with a student who was a graduate of a private school in Washington, D.C., he was a wheelchair user, and he also had very limited mobility. So he was unable to transfer himself from his wheelchair to chairs or to his bed. So his family contacted me in June to discuss housing at Georgetown and to begin preparing for him to start school at the end of August. So we had about 2.5 months. And through my meetings with the student and the family, it became evident that they hadn't really thought about how he was going to live independently on campus. The mother had thought that the student's roommate could assist him with getting in and out of bed and with other supports. And he had planned on living with a friend from high school. Um, I had raised a concern about emergency evacuation and what would happen if the roommate was not around. And it became even more clear after that conversation that there was a lot more to think about in terms of the supports that this student would need in order to be able to live on campus. Ultimately, he and his family had to hire a personal care attendant to live with him and support him with his daily care. And I was able to work with the mother and the student to develop a plan on how we would address his needs at Georgetown, thinking about things like classroom relocation, building accessibility, making sure that he had accessible furniture in his dorm room and in his classrooms. And I was able to point them to some agencies for finding a personal care attendant, because that's what they chose to do, go through an agency. But this now meant that the student was not only an incoming first-year student, a typical 18-year-old boy, but he was also an employer. And there were some challenges that came along with that for him. So we had regular check-ins to kind of troubleshoot some of those issues. But I couldn't help, at that time, I couldn't help but thinking that this student's needs could have been addressed a lot more comprehensively and with greater time and care had someone had a conversation with him about transition and independent living prior to him matriculating to Georgetown University. So this is where I can now come in and support students in similar situations through Accessible College, because now I've worked with a number of students who have navigated similar situations. So I'm not putting this up to scare everyone, but I wanted to provide some context on typical college planning timelines. And I feel like this helps just kind of contextualize the whole process, especially if you haven't been thinking about it. So this is just the general process. I'm not a college consultant, but I work with a lot of college consultants and high school guidance counselors too. So I've picked up a lot of information and working with the client base that I work with too. So usually, and this isn't specific to students with disabilities, this is just a general college planning timeline. So typically in the student's junior year, the student will start learning about colleges, maybe going on college tours. They might have ACT and SAT prep during that time too. And then December to February, we would have ACT and SAT. That's what you're taking. This is your junior year. You're talking to college reps. Now a lot of college rep visits are happening online through virtual panels. So students would be engaging in the kind of middle section of their junior year, looking at scholarships. March through May, a student might be taking that ACT or SAT. Maybe they're taking AP exams. June through August of your junior year of high school, typically you're visiting colleges. Now a lot of college tours are online through different services that you can take, kind of virtual college tours, drafting your essay, doing any interview prep that you need to be doing, getting those recommendation letters, and outlining financial aid and needs that you might have to be able to cover the cost of college. So that's a lot. There's a lot of moving parts in that junior year of high school. Going into your senior year, students in the beginning of the school year might be retaking their ACT or SAT, revising or tightening up those essays, gathering those application materials that they need to have in order to apply, submitting early decision. And early decision, there are some schools that will take students for early decision, so you can apply early and get a decision back early if you want to know before kind of that May timeline. The other piece here in the September to November of senior year is creating a CSS profile, and CSS is the College Scholarship Service Profile through the College Board for your FAFSA, and FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It's kind of like alphabet soup. Um, FAFSA and CSS. And so then you've got December through February, you're getting a response on any early decision. You're submitting your regular decision applications during that time. You're submitting your FAFSA during that time. March through May, the final part of your senior year of high school, you're updating that FAFSA if there's any new information from taxes that you submitted. You're getting a response on those regular decision. You're comparing the aid packages that the schools might be offering you, and then you're committing to a school. Then you're taking any AP exams, and then of course you're graduating at the end of your senior year. So that's going on as well. So really, that takes you up to June, and then you have about 2.5 months until you're kind of going to college, because it's usually mid to late August where students start to move on campus, if that's happening. But during that time, you're also getting information from that college. You are getting an advisor, you're selecting your classes, you're selecting your housing. So there's a ton of moving parts really from the beginning of junior year through senior year, which is why we start working with students so early, which brings us to this slide. So we start working with students at Accessible College starting in the 9th grade through graduate school to get them working on skills that'll serve them in college. The service that we provide is really customized to each individual student, and we're able to look at the student holistically and consider their individual needs and craft a process with them. So I take a coaching approach, and I work with students and families to identify goals, and I engage students in the process because they're a huge part of this process. They are an essential piece of it. So that they walk away with the tools to be able to navigate independently and to be prepared for that transition. So these are things that a lot of other support professionals don't always provide because they don't have the experience and the content knowledge and the skill set related to this specific population of students. So I have that added skill set of having worked in the disability support office at the university level, so I know the process from the inside. I've included a general timeline here of when students and families should be working on these pieces and when we at Accessible College typically start working on these pieces with students. So we'll talk through them. So we start working with students on college accommodations. Usually sometime during their junior year of high school is a good time to get started on this. So we outline the types of accommodations that they might need in the college setting in order to inform that search and that tour process so that they can be thinking about it and asking questions when they're engaging with people at the university, when they're looking at those schools. Considerations for college based on healthcare needs, we typically start that during the student's sophomore year of high school. And the reason that we do that is because they might need a specific type of medical support either on campus or near campus. So a hospital center or a specific type of doctor nearby. So that might really inform your college search process altogether. So you might be looking for a university medical center that's on campus or near campus, or you might be looking for something that's close to home so that your student can stay with the same doctors. So we want to look at those healthcare needs and figure out what they are in order to inform that search process, or to at least be a piece of the puzzle if it's not the main deciding factor. Medication management, we start working with students on that during freshman year of high school. And really, you start as early as you can. So medication management, so thinking through, is your student able to get a prescription? Do they have a system for taking their own medications? I work with students on figuring out what those systems and practices are. And it's better for them to get started when they're at home so that they're in a nurturing environment, so that once they go away to school, they actually have a practice in place that they can just implement seamlessly. Healthcare management is a big piece. I start working with students as early as freshman year of high school. Things like knowing who all their doctors are, being able to make their own doctor's appointments, preparing for that appointment. So working with them on questions that they can be asking their doctors knowing how to speak with the doctor and feeling comfortable speaking with the doctor. So the earlier that you can get started working with your student on these pieces, the better off they'll be. I also work with students to kind of comprehensively put together lists and systems so that they know who their doctors are and how to contact them, what medications they're on, so that if they're in college and they need that information, they can easily access it and they don't have to keep calling home to mom or dad to help them out. Um, the other piece here is hiring and managing a personal care attendant. I usually start working with students on that process by the end of their junior year of high school. And the reason is we work with students and families to prepare an outline of every aspect of the student's day. So from the student waking up to the student going to bed, anything that happens during the night, and outlining all of those steps and pieces so that when they hand that care over to either a hired personal care attendant or to an agency to support that student in college, all of that information is already there. I think for a lot of families who've just been kind of doing these things, obviously, and real how many pieces there are to that puzzle. And so if you can write all those things out and get those things going early, then you can have an easier transfer of care. Um, I help families look at home health agencies versus private hires and other options for getting a PCA on a college campus too. So I've worked with students who have ended up hiring just nursing students to come and assist them and support them through the day based on their needs. So there are kind of different systems that you might be able to put in place. It could be a private hire, it could be through an agency, it could be a group of students who you're hiring too. So there's a lot of different models for this. And so I help people figure out what model is best for them. And then the other pieces here are about continuity of care. So we work with families to think through, what doctors they're going to need to see at school and how they're transferring that care. And that's something that usually happens towards that senior year of high school. Once they've determined which school they're going to go to, we can start to work on those pieces to put everything in place. Self-advocacy skills, you cannot start early enough as far as I'm concerned. We start working with students as early as freshman year of high school, so that they're developing those skills that they need to be able to effectively communicate their needs and concerns. And one way to start is to include the student in the conversations about their education and their care. So that might be including them in IEP meetings or 504 meetings, including them in conversations with their doctor as well, their healthcare provider. Disability disclosure. So by the end of sophomore year of high school, students will need to know their rights, and they need to understand who they have to disclose to and what type of information they need to disclose and who they don't need to disclose to. So that's really important for that, so that students feel comfortable understanding who they have to make those disclosures to. Communicating with the college's disability support office, we start that at the end of sophomore year as well. So figuring out, how do you reach out to that office? What information do you need to share? And crafting kind of questions and preparing for those meetings, which is a good segue to this final one, disability specific questions for the college tours and tour debriefs with the student. So by the end of the sophomore year of high school, we work with students to create questions on their specific needs and how that would be handled at that college. Because if you ask a university, they're all going to tell you that they're ADA compliant, right? And so you need to be asking specific questions about the student's needs and figuring out if they will actually accommodate the student in a specific way. So we guide families and students through figuring out what the best questions to ask are. This is a general timeline. And obviously the earlier that we can start working with students, the better. However, if a student comes to Accessible College during their senior year of high school, we meet them where they're at, and we'll start to work with the students on the pieces that make the most sense for them at that time. The needs of students with paralysis are unique. So I've supported a number of students with physical disabilities in a variety of ways, some of which might be figuring out like the best method and equipments for getting your laundry down to the laundry room without having to carry a laundry basket, or developing and sharing an emergency evacuation plan for once you're living on campus. how to get what they need in their residence hall rooms. So there's tons of examples of things like that that might not come up when a student is living at home and don't really come up a lot in the high school setting too. So that's where we at Accessible College can be really impactful in helping students and families kind of think through all of those intricacies. So if this has piqued your interest and you are a student with paralysis or you work with students with paralysis, to get a consultation from Accessible College, the way to do that would be to call the information specialist at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation at 1-800-539-7309, or you can go online to www.christopherreeve.org/ask, and an information specialist will get back to you. And then the way that this process is going to work with this project, the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation will forward your request to me at Accessible College for this consultation. And here's a little bit about what students can expect from that process. So once we receive your information from the Reeve Foundation, we will contact you to do a little online intake and learn more about the student's needs. And then Accessible College will send the family, the student and the family, a link to sign up for a meeting. Meetings will be conducted via Zoom or over the telephone. Meetings are approximately 1 hour long, and through this project, Accessible College is able to meet with the client for up to 3 sessions. So that's 3 1-hour sessions. And once we determine where the student is in the process of, going to school, thinking about school, searching for a college, and what tools would be most useful, we will work with the student and family to create customized planning documents. So those could be, some examples could be like the transfer of care, or thinking through the student's needs to hire a personal care attendant, or questions for their college tours, or looking at their accommodations and seeing what accommodations they might need in the college setting, what they should be thinking about. So after every session with the student, we will send a short recap email about what we talked about and a little to-do list with anything the student or the parent needs to follow up on. And again, it's a totally customized service. So everything that we do is tailored to meet that individual student's needs. So now, and I saw a couple questions pop up, we will take any questions you have. So if you have any questions, you can put them in down the bottom. There's Q&A, and there's also chat as well. And I'm seeing questions come in, which is exciting. So I will, I'll start answering those questions. And while we're doing that, I'm also just going to put up this contact information because I know people will want this. So this is the contact information for the Reeve Foundation Information Specialist. So if you have a student, or you are a student with paralysis who wants to join this project, you can contact the Reeve Foundation. And then for anyone else who's just interested in Accessible College more generally, I've put my website down here, and it's accessiblecollege.com, and you can email me at info@accessiblecollege. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I write a lot about students with physical disabilities and health conditions transitioning to college, so there might be some information that you're interested in. So let me answer some of these questions. So I see, what is the cost of using this program? That is a great question. It's free. So the Reeve Foundation, and I can't say that enough, it's free. The Reeve Foundation is covering these sessions through, so the student goes through the Reeve Foundation, it comes from the Reeve Foundation to me, and I'm able to meet with the student for up to 3 1-hour sessions to get this transition planning going. Another question that I'm seeing here now, my student is starting his junior year now. Is it too early to start working on transition? It is never too early to start working on transition. So I think junior year is a great time. Actually, I think it's the perfect time because you're starting to get into that college search process. I would say families should be thinking about starting a lot earlier if you can. Sometimes that's not possible. So some of these things can start freshman, sophomore year of high school. Some of these skills and tools we might want to start working on junior year of high school. Let's see. So there's some other questions here. Is the service available in Spanish? Not currently available in Spanish. My Spanish is not really great. But hopefully that would be something that we could branch out to and think about in the future as well. Can you assist someone who has started college already and is not receiving the services that they need? That's a great question, and we might have to follow up with you on that. I'm not sure if that would be covered through this Reeve Foundation project. Through my private practice, Accessible College, I do work with students on what I call post-transition coaching. And so I do work with students in my private practice to help and support and help them navigate college once they are actually in college and figure out accommodations. Oh, there's so many good questions here. You guys have all the great questions. Okay. What is the school district's responsibility to support the student during in transition during high school? Okay, so if your student has an IEP, there is a transition component of the IEP process. So typically they're having a conversation with student about, do you want to go to to work, or do you want to go to school? And they're walking them through that process. Voc Rehab also does this as well. So there might be some supports that you can take advantage of there. However, I would say that some of these services and resources that the school district provides aren't as thorough as what we would be doing with the student, because of my background in the higher education setting and really knowing what the universities are thinking about and what services might be available in the university setting and how that's different from the high school setting. That's where we're getting into that like nitty gritty and helping that student figure out what they might need to be successful in the college setting. So that's a roundabout answer to say that school districts have varying levels of support for students in transition. Is a child required to have paralysis, or can they have another physical disability like cerebral palsy? That's another great question. I would recommend that you call the information specialist to talk through that specific question. Again, in my private practice, I do work with students with cerebral palsy as well, and all types of physical disabilities and mobility impairments too. So you can check out some of the resources or check out the services that I have on my website as well. Let's see, is your service a good idea if my son is planning to start at a junior college and transfer to a four-year college? This is a great question too. So yeah, I work with a lot of students who are starting junior colleges or community colleges, and in hopes of transferring to a four-year college in the future. And it's actually a great time to kind of get started on some of these pieces, because we can also start to think through not just the academic accommodations and those pieces, but starting to think about the independent living pieces if they want to live independently. So this could be a good fit for them as well. And let's see, I saw another question pop up. I'm doing the Q&A and the chat, so here we go. So how do you use the Voc Rehab service program? It's available in each state. This question is about Voc Rehab, and let's see. Did one of the folks at the Reeve Foundation have an answer for this? Or okay, now I'm just like seeing things pop up my screen. Okay, so Voc Rehab, each individual state, students can apply for Voc Rehab once they're 16 years old. Sometimes your school, if your student is in school, will help you with that process. Other times you have to reach out to Voc Rehab. It's a little bit different in every state. They do similar work to this, but again, each state has a limited amount of funding, and they take students for Voc Rehab based on who has the most significant need for services. And so you might not find exactly what you're looking for through Voc Rehab in terms of students with physical disabilities transitioning to college. So this could be a good fit for someone who has paralysis and is really considering college and has the ability to make it to college academically. So Voc Rehab is always a great resource. You should check in with them for sure, see what they offer and see what they say. All right, yes, and the other question here was about, is it free sessions for paralysis related diagnosis only? And again, I would say contact the information specialist, and the contact information is up on the page right now, on the screen right now. And so that number is 1-800-539-7309, or you can go online as well. Okay, so another question that has come to me here is, this is one I get a lot too. It's, what is the best college for wheelchair users, or what are the best colleges for wheelchair users? It's kind of a tricky question, right? Because students with physical disabilities, just like all students, are looking at the different programs that a school might have. So they might be looking at, academic fit, looking at some of the things that a school might offer. And accessibility is not always at the top of every student who uses a wheelchair's list. But with that in mind, there are some schools that are more accessible, physically accessible than other schools, and I say physically accessible like that because there are different types of accessibility, right? So there's programmatic accessibility, there's physical accessibility. There are 2 schools that actually offer personal care attendants kind of built into their programs. Those schools are Wright State in Michigan and the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana in Illinois. And they have personal care attendants as a part of their program, and you'd have to look into each of those specific schools to see how you would get that personal care attendant service. In terms of physical accessibility, there are a lot of schools that have adaptive sports and adaptive fitness teams, like the University of Arizona, the University of Michigan. Oh yeah, Wright is in Ohio. You're right. I knew it was in the Midwest. I got so close. I was one state over. So there we go. Yeah, so now okay, so now I've lost my track. So anyway, so some of those schools that have adaptive fitness programs are very, very accessible schools, and some of those are state schools. And I actually have done a lot of writing on students who are interested in adaptive fitness and adaptive sports transitioning to college too. So if you go to my website and you check out my blog, you can see, and I'll repost some of these things today too, you can see some information on different schools that have adaptive sports and fitness programs, and those are often schools that are more physically accessible. So that might be really helpful to look at too. But I would also say, accessibility is a huge component of this, but a student shouldn't, just be limited to a campus that they think might be more physically accessible to them. They should explore all college campuses that have their things that they're interested in. And it can be a factor. For some students, it might be the factor. And for other students, it might be, a thing that they're willing to like navigate and negotiate. So it just kind of depends on the individual's needs, I'd say. Can I provide some assistance with AT recommendations? So AT being assistive technology. I work a little bit with AT, mostly around organizational skills, study skills, strategies, and academics, and also kind of thinking through some of the needs that a student might have in a residential living hall facility. But I would also say you can check out your state's Voc Rehab for that, and your state might have an assistive technology service as well, where students can get either assessments or free resources for assistive technology too. So that's like another kind of place where you can look for AT support. What are some things that families can do independently to prepare for the transition to college? I think that some of those things are starting to let your student kind of take the reins with some of these pieces of thinking through their doctor's visits, of making their own appointments, starting to work on some of the medication management pieces, maybe even having conversations about what it might look like for that student to live independently, and asking the student kind of to paint a picture of what their ideal living situation would be. And Bernadette wrote a funny response, which is true. Learn to do laundry. It's huge. Yeah. I mean, so ironically, a lot of universities now partner with laundry services, like for the typical student population. So some students just opt to send their laundry out each week and have it done and returned to them. And so there are kind of different models. I've worked with students to figure out, I had a student I worked with who had a mobility impairment, and he didn't use a wheelchair, but he needed assistance walking. And so he was like, how do I get this laundry down to the laundry room? And so we figured out that if he got a laundry cart that was on wheels, he could use that to help him hold himself up and push that along, and use that to bring down in the elevator to then do his laundry. Now, whether or not he actually did his laundry in a timely fashion is a totally different question. um, Again, so we got that question about, do I help students who want to go to community college? Absolutely. So we would work with students who are going to community college too. Community college can be kind of a great gateway into getting into a four-year university. So we will work with students wherever they're at in that college process. There was a question here about suggestions on affordable PCA, personal care attendance, and costs. As I mentioned before, personal care attendants are not provided by the college. And so that's something that the family would have to pay for either through state services or through federal support and assistance, or pay for by themselves. So there's a couple different models. So sometimes people will hire a individual. Sometimes people will go through a home health agency. And a lot of people like to do that so that they know that their student's going to have care. And sometimes students will use, depending on what supports they need, they might actually hire a group of students if their college has a nursing school or an OT program, an occupational therapy program, or a PT program, or something that's like along those lines. They might be able to hire a number of students to come and kind of cycle through and help them with whatever those needs might be. That is one of the cheaper solutions. It's not always feasible. And to be totally honest, like, those are other college students, and college students do what college students do. So they might not show up on time. There might be some glitches in the system, but that is one more affordable way. But it kind of depends on like what your students' needs are. Bernadette noted here too that some voc rehabs will cover the costs that are needed to attend and get to classes. So that's another kind of source and way to look for it. The other piece here is that some students will opt to bring a family member or a friend or a sibling as their personal care attendant to college, so that if someone is willing to, I don't know, either work remotely from a dorm room or can take time to be there for that student and the student agrees, that is another thing that I have seen happen. So some students do that. There's a question down here too about Medicaid waivers and enable accounts helping to pay for a PCA. And in my experience, like the Medicaid piece can be challenging and variable. So each individual case is going to be distinct. So that's kind of one caveat. So there isn't like a great blanket statement there. And enable accounts, I'm actually not sure. That's something I would have to look into to see if you could use that. And maybe Bernadette or someone else knows a little bit more about using the enable accounts to pay for the PCA. So Bernadette, if you're listening in, and you can chime in there in the chat. I think we have time for just one more question. Okay. So a local community college, and this is does not allow a parent PCA to be in class, and that this parent is asking, what if we can't find one? So as I mentioned, different colleges will have different policies on who is allowed to be a PCA and how they're processing that. I would have questions about why a parent could not act as a PCA if the student needs that for a reasonable accommodation. So I think that might be something you want to pursue with that community college. And what other options might be available to that student. Because again, colleges, community colleges, universities should be engaging that student in the interactive process. And if the student has the documentation to support the need, I would question why they would not be allowed to bring whoever they choose as their PCA. And with that, I'm just going to repeat again the contact information here just for everybody who's listening. And if you have more questions too, you can contact the information specialist at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation at 1-800-539-7309 or go online to www.christopherreeve.org/ask and you'll have the information specialist will get back to you. And my information is down here. You can find me on my website, which is www.accessiblecollege.com, or you can email me at info@accessiblecollege.com. I'm at Twitter, and my Twitter handle is down there at ACSS College, and I'm on Facebook at Accessible College, so you can connect with me there as well. And I think with that, we will wrap it up for today. And I just want to thank everybody, and I'm super excited about this project. So thank you all for coming today. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon. Thanks.